Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Patsi Davies taku ingoa. I was a sprint athlete in my young days, and I feel like I'm going to have to sprint through these 15 minutes to kind of get to the goal line at the end. So off we go. Why am I interested in this topic? I, as a young master's student, had a research job at Tukanui Hospital in the alcoholic unit. And every day that I went to work, I had to just kind of literally battle my way through the haze of smoke inside the rooms and the buildings at Tukanui Hospital. Smoking was just a norm, but I'd grown up in a largely smoke-free family, so that was quite a new thing for me. And then 30 years later, I was working at the Henry Rongomo Bennett Centre here in Hamilton. That's the inpatient psychiatric service there. And I was employed as a smoke-free coordinator, and I was talking to the administrator who was going down to the local wholesaler. And I said, you know, what do you buy from the wholesaler? And she pulled out her list and she's reading through it and she said, tobacco. And I said, tobacco? You mean you buy tobacco? Who uses tobacco? And she said, oh, we give it to the patients. So I had been employed for this job. I was so gobsmacked that that is what was going on. And so it really stayed with me about what was going on here. And now I have turned that into a PhD topic. And I'm really looking at the question of why did the district health boards exclude their mental health services, their facilities in particular, from their smoke-free policies. For today, I'm literally just taking a snapshot of my literature review work, and I will be briefly looking at the historical culture around smoking, because that's existed since probably the early 1900s, and then looking at the way in which staff have resisted the smoke-free policies, and then attempting to throw some understanding across that. And I feel like when Mark talked about the green flash, that this is the kind of green flash that I had this morning after a walk around the city in the dark. So just so that you can see this, and I won't be covering all of this, because it's simply not possible, but smoking in mental health facilities sits inside a really complicated context. So here we've got resistance. Here we've got all the factors that influence that resistance in the latter part of the last century. And then we've got the first part of the last century sitting in here. So just to focus on the pre-1950 period, what was going on there that was important? Well, all of these things are important. I'm going to focus on two of them. The first one will be tobacco advertising, and the second one is what was called a comfort fund. Advertising. You may not know it, but doctors and nurses were involved in tobacco advertising prior to the 1950s, and Eric's eyes have gone wide, and after the 1950s. They were absolutely and really involved in it. And the advertising at the time was all about promoting these ideas here, that smoking was a rational choice, it was autonomous thing you could do, a sense of freedom. But with doctors and nurses, the messages that were being used was that they were trusted authority figures. They could emphasise product safety, and it was a message of reassurance, which was to be largely about a harmless recreational product. So let me show you just quickly some examples. So starting with nurses. Here we have nurse here, notice here, nurse in the hospital context, and here, the specialist nurse here, even with the lady with the lamp. Doctors. Doctors played a really key role in this, and in fact had really high rates of smoking as well, as do nurses. Here, in the hospital context, or in the veterans actually, here, this one here, and here, again, more doctors smoke Camels.
It's just getting scratched, I think it's just clip it to the side.
That's more time, Scott. So you can be having a good look at the advertisements. So the one on the right, again, while promoting smoking, it's also about brand loyalty. And in fact, doctors around leading up to the 1950s were very significant smokers of Camel cigarettes. Thank you. So just illustrations for you to have a quick look at. Now, the patient comfort fund, the second major thing that happened pre-1950s was there were big reforms going on inside the psychiatric hospitals around this time. So we're looking at 1947, and the idea was for the mental health services to emulate, and I'll quote here, emulate normal community life as much as possible. And the normalisation of smoking found its way into that. And a patient comfort fund was established. And part of what the comfort fund could be used for was for cigarettes. So here we have the state involved in the in making money available for patients in the mental health facilities to buy cigarettes. So what do we know by the time we get to the 1950s? And my lit review covers these 5 countries, so if you want to talk to me afterwards about what these are, you can. But by the 1950s, between 1945 and 1955, on average across here, we had 70% of men smoking and 33% of women smoking. Why is this a big deal? Because at the start of that century, hardly anyone smoked cigarettes. So we moved from that environment up to this size of smoking. So the theme for the first half of the century was normalisation. The second half of last century, the theme is denormalisation. A lot of factors influencing in here. I'm just going to focus on some of them. For example, the evidence. So prior to the 1950s, there was very little idea that smoking might cause harm, except that what we did know was that the rate of lung cancer was increasing. And the scientists weren't too sure what that was about. So in the 1950s, Sir Richard Dole and Austin Bradford, the sort of guy who established epidemiology, did some research and established that smoking, so mainstream smoke, caused lung cancer. And then in the 1980s, Hirayama from Japan demonstrated that second-hand smoke also caused lung cancer. So 1950s, 1980s, the main body of evidence around the harm from smoking. Following on from there, across all of the countries, governments started to introduce smoke-free policies, including legislation. If we drop down into here, because this is important for me because I'm looking at district health boards, we had our district health boards were set up, and their objectives included protecting, improving and promoting the health of New Zealanders, and also providing the best care for people in need. So those are 2 really important things that I would like you to remember. So by 2003, what did we know about smoking and mental health? What we know is that people with a mental health diagnosis smoke more cigarettes, inhale more deeply and smoke more frequently. We also know that, and this is across the countries as well, between 30 to 40% of cigarettes purchased are purchased by people with a mental health diagnosis. So that's quite a significant number. We know that smoking reduces people's life expectancy. It reduces it more for people with a mental health diagnosis, and you're looking at between 7 and 10 years. Inequalities already existing for the mental health community, exacerbated by smoking. Certainly by 2014, what we know from a very good piece of systematic review work is that if you quit smoking, your mental health improves. So that's the backdrop of what was going on there. So important. Our laws, our first one came in 1990, the second one came in 2003. And in both cases, smoking was not prohibited in the mental health setting. You could still continue to smoke. But 2003 was really important because it was a tipping point. Because what the legislation actually said was that the hospital manager may permit smoking. I've got a law background, so I'm interested in that word may. It's discretionary. So they could have stopped it or kept it going. They actually kept it going. They put in ventilation systems, but we know that the ventilation systems did not pick up the fine particulate matter, so both patients and staff were busily still being exposed to it. So that's really important. It didn't happen then. What do they do instead? They develop smoke-free policies in the DHBs, but they exempt their mental health facilities across the country. That is what happened. So you may look surprised about that, but there are more surprises to come. So let's look at staff resistance, because that's the focus for me today. The staff resistance is made up of I think, 2 important institutional practices and then a series of beliefs. But actually the beliefs are myths because they're not supported by evidence. But Mark sort of talked about how this kind of thing can work. So resistance looks like this. So I will use this to talk to and take you through it. And I've really thought hard about how I could simplify a complex matter to share it with you. So starting here, supply of tobacco, that's an institutional practice. That is really important if you want to normalise smoking inside an institution. And again, the state is buying this. Boredom. Boredom has long been a part of mental health facilities. And I think there's an arguable case to be made that smoking kind of, if you think about smoke, finds its way everywhere. Well, smoking arguably has filled a gap around the boredom inside the hospitals. But central to all of this is what is known as the therapeutic relationship. And the language of this is important because it's wrapped up in therapy talk, therapy language, therapeutic relationship. And what this is about is that patients and staff have smoked together for decades. And the idea in behind it is that you manage to establish and build rapport with patients when you smoke with them. Never mind if you don't smoke, I don't know what that says about communication skills, but that's the argument there. It's a strongly held belief and practice. So working through the beliefs around here, I'll start with only pleasure. The view here is that smoking is the only pleasure for these poor people in life. That is a very paternalistic position to take, but it is a strongly held belief. Belief that mental health patients are too fragile to undertake smoking cessation. Belief that it is somehow infringing their rights. There is no right to smoke, and that's been established in the New Zealand court cases and those overseas as well. There's a choice to smoke, but that is usually constrained by other factors. In fact, the DHBs have a property right, and that influences who can smoke. Oh, 5 minutes to go, right. View that there is no point in helping with quitting because they don't actually want to quit. That's not true. That there would be an increase in aggression or people leave early. The evidence doesn't bear that out. The other important factor was that they should treat the illness first, except that nicotine addiction is one of the categories in the diagnostic and statistical manual that is used by the mental health services. So it's in there. So those are the beliefs, the large beliefs. So how might we explain this? Okay. Very quickly, at one level, and this is kind of on the surface, you might say prima facie on the surface level, we could say, well, this is institutionalised normalisation. That's what's gone on here. We can also say, and the evidence suggests this, that smoking's been used as a patient management tool. It's familiar and it's not surprising that staff would want to protect that and hang on to that and be resistant to change. And thirdly, we know that there's been a really poor, slow uptake of education and training within mental health. So the opportunity to scotch beliefs and myths just really hasn't been there. But I'm more interested in what else might be going on here. What's another level under this? So for example, I've actually got this on the board over here. So I'm hoping that you can all see it, but we didn't have very good pens. So we didn't have very good pens. So can you see that? Yeah, cool, okay. Because I might do this instead of going through the slides, but I can come back to the slides. So if we note that what's going on here, let's just move away from staff resistance and look at smoke-free policy. What we can say is that the exemption, at the point of being exempt from the smoke-free policy, what's happening then is that that's an exception to the rule. Because remember, the rule is to be smoke-free. Is that clear? Okay. So if we move down here, when there's an exception to the rule, what's going on then is that you do not get the benefits and protections of that rule, the rule to be smoke-free. And arguably in here, we can say that at that point in time, that population is abandoned. So I'm now drawing on the work of Giorgio Agamben, who's my theorist that I'm looking at, an abandoned population in here with no legal or human rights protections in relation to smoking. Is that clear? Okay. And so moving on down here, got the abandoned population, I'll come to that. Moving to here, if we look at the district health boards, so you've got all this going on here, but the district health boards have got the statutory obligation to protect people and provide the best care for their needs. But we've got this happening. So abandoned population. So an abandoned population arguably is deemed unworthy of care. Now that is not a very palatable idea. You may feel uncomfortable hearing that, but actually that's not a new idea to people in mental health services at all, for the patients in mental health. And after all, mental health is the only clinical service that continued with smoking in the time of denormalisation. Everyone else has stopped it. So moving back to the abandoned population, what we have here is it's not just abandonment from the legal and human rights protections, but also the people in that abandoned situation are vulnerable to the whims of the decision maker. There is no protection in there in relation to that. And so right down to the bottom here, there are no checks and balances available when a group or a population is in that situation. Think Guantanamo Bay, think Australian detention centres, looks like we're going to get a change there. And so smoking continues. So that's that's an outline of what has happened there, and here's how it all comes together. For me here, I am yet to do my interviews and my work. Sorry, and so the minus canary is usually an indicator that other stuff's going on. So I'm very interested to hear from my interviewees about what else is going on. And so for me, to wrap everything together in concluding remarks, staff resistance, we know that from the literature, that has gone on. There's been ongoing smoking while people have been in state care, and the state has been supplying the tobacco, and the staff have been affected by that as well. Denormalisation occurred everywhere else. And what I want to say is that this is a population group who was no less entitled to be protected. Thank you. Oh, yes, stand up. Well done, remembering. In the absence of the chair, has anyone got any questions? I'm just taking over from you.
Just quickly changing the sign on the door.
Thank you.
All right, we'll start with Erica, because she was closest to me.
So who are you going to be? You're saying staff, but who are you going to be?
I will be interviewing people who've been involved in the development, the implementation and the monitoring of smoke-free policies. Yeah.
And these people are within the DHB or higher up?
They may be in the DHB. I'll be looking at politicians and former politicians, so because policies are also pitched at that level. And clearly the Ministry of Health, Department of Health actually has a role in this. Yeah.
And how many would you have?
Just under 30. I think just around 30 is what I'm looking at, yeah. Thank you, Erica.
As you know, I'm incredibly interested in this. You mentioned the systematic review and you found something in 2014 which showed that when people stop smoking, their mental health improves. Does the systematic review actually show cause and effect, or do they just show that those two things are linked?
They just show that those two things are linked, yeah.
I mean, some people aren't going to like what you're doing. They could actually...
I know that.
They could actually argue that it's the other way around. When people's mental health improves, they stop smoking. And there's no cause and effect for that either.
Oh, no, sorry. The link is clear that people's mental health improves when they quit smoking.
So they have shown...
Yes, sorry, yes, yeah.
So it couldn't be the other way around, that when people's...
This was a very, very significant systematic review, and I guess it sort of blew the socks off people working in the field. Yeah.
But have they actually shown cause and effect?
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
So there might be some people who are going to find you probing a bit embarrassing, awkward. They might resist a wee bit. What sort of difficulties do you think you might strike in trying to get the information that you need?
Well, I think I've thought about that because one of the difficulties might be that people smoke.
Yeah.
People that I want to interview smoke, and so they are. Well, in my own experience, people have been quite sensitive about that, and so I think that that's a korero for me and that person to have about their own comfort, and if they didn't want to continue with that, well, they're welcome to stop as well.
So you think you might meet a little bit of resistance just out of the stigma factor for these sorts of people?
I'm not interviewing any service users, so I'm just sticking with the staff area. There may be that, but I think what's really interesting is that we're behind other countries when it comes to sorting out our mental health services and smoking. And I think that the body of people that I want to learn from and interview may well be quite relieved to have the conversation about it. Yeah, because there's some bit of a silence around this. Like this business of buying the tobacco, that has just flown under the radar of the politicians and all sorts of people. Actually, at conferences when I used to talk about it, I used to wonder if Dame Tariana knew about this as Associate Minister.
I don't think many people do. They don't think the general public does.
No. Yeah. Good, thank you.
Questions? In that case, what I'd just like to do is, well, first of all, have a round of applause